Right now, you are looking at a country that has been invaded, occupied, revolutionized, and rebuilt more times than almost any nation on earth. A country that gave the world democracy, dictatorship, fine wine, and the guillotine, sometimes in the same decade. A country where peasants stormed a palace, where a short Corsican soldier conquered half of Europe, where artists reinvented beauty, and where philosophers wrote ideas so dangerous that kings tried to burn them. This is France, and its story starts not with baguettes or berets, but with blood. Before France existed, there was Gaul, and Gaul was not a peaceful place. The Gauls were Celtic tribes, fierce, independent, skilled warriors. They had no single king, no unified state. Just hundreds of tribal leaders, each controlling their own patch of land, constantly fighting each other. They built hilltop fortresses called oppida. They traded with the Mediterranean world. They had their own priests, the Druids, who held enormous power and kept their rituals completely secret. No Roman ever fully understood them. For centuries, this worked. Gaul was wild, decentralized, and free. Then Julius Caesar arrived. In 58 BC, Caesar launches what he calls a defensive campaign against migrating tribes threatening Roman allies. Within a year, it becomes something else entirely, a full-scale conquest. Caesar spends 8 years systematically crushing every tribe in Gaul, battle after battle, siege after siege. The Romans are organized, disciplined, ruthless. The Gauls fight bravely, but they cannot unite in time. By 50 BC, it is over. Gaul belongs to Rome. The numbers are staggering. Ancient sources, which may be exaggerated, but still tell you something, claim 1 million Gauls killed and another million enslaved. Whether those exact figures are accurate or not, the destruction is catastrophic. Entire tribes effectively disappear from history. But Rome does not just conquer, it builds. Roman engineers carve roads through forests that had never seen a straight line. They build aqueducts that carry fresh water to cities that didn't exist a generation earlier. They raise amphitheaters, forums, bathhouses. Lugdunum, modern Lyon, becomes the capital of Roman Gaul, a thriving city of perhaps 50,000 people. The city of Nemausus, modern Ninchems, gets an aqueduct so well built that part of it, the Pont du Gard, still stands today, 2,000 years later. At its peak, Roman Gaul has over 4 million people. It is the most densely populated province in the entire empire. The Gauls don't disappear, they adapt. Within 2 generations, they are speaking Latin, wearing Roman clothes, serving in Roman armies, building Roman temples. The Gallo-Roman civilization that emerges is something new, not purely Celtic, not purely Roman, but a blend that will form the genetic and cultural foundation of France. For nearly 4 centuries, this works beautifully. Then Rome begins to fall apart. By the early 400s AD, the Roman Empire is collapsing under its own weight. Corruption, economic crisis, and constant pressure from Germanic tribes outside the borders are tearing it apart. The legions that once seemed invincible are stretched thin, underpaid, and demoralized. In 410, Visigoths sack Rome itself. The psychological shock is enormous. For 800 years, the city had been untouchable. Now it burns. Gaul becomes a free-for-all. Vandals, Visigoths, Burgundians, and other Germanic tribes pour across the Rhine and settle wherever they can hold ground. The roads fall into disrepair. Trade collapses. Cities shrink. The sophisticated Gallo-Roman civilization that Rome had built retreats into the countryside. Out of this chaos, one tribe rises above the rest, the Franks. The Franks had been living along the Rhine for centuries, sometimes fighting Rome, sometimes serving in its armies. They are tough, practical, and politically shrewd. Their king Clovis I takes power around 481 AD, and within 20 years he has done something none of his predecessors managed. He unites the Frankish tribes and defeats every rival kingdom in Gaul. But Clovis makes one decision that changes everything. He converts to Christianity. Not the Arian Christianity that most Germanic kings had adopted, which the Roman Church considered heresy, but Orthodox Catholic Christianity. He is baptized around 498 AD, along with 3,000 of his warriors, in a ceremony in Reims that will echo through French history for the next 1,300 years. Almost every French king after him will be crowned in the same city, in the same tradition. This single decision, one king, one church, creates an alliance between Frankish military power and Roman Catholic authority that will shape France for the next 14 centuries. The Frankish kingdom grows. Under the Merovingian dynasty after Clovis, it expands and contracts with various wars and royal family feuds. The Merovingian kings become increasingly weak, power shifting to their court officials called the mayors of the palace. One of those mayors is a man named Charles Martel. In 732 AD, a Muslim army from Spain pushes deep into Frankish territory, reaching central France near the city of Tours. Charles Martel meets them with his infantry and defeats them decisively. The Battle of Tours stops the Muslim advance into Western Europe. Whether this battle truly changed the course of history or was simply one of many raids is debated by historians, but it makes Charles Martel a legend. His grandson takes the legend even further. Charlemagne, Charles the Great, becomes king of the Franks in 768 AD. Over the next 3 decades, he conquers more of Europe than anyone since the Roman emperors. He pushes into modern Germany, defeats the Saxons after 30 years of brutal warfare, campaigns into Spain, and subdues tribes across Central Europe. His empire at its peak stretches from the Atlantic coast to the border of modern Hungary. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. For a moment, a single ruler holds Western Europe together again. Charlemagne is not just a warrior. He sets up schools, standardizes weights and measures, promotes literacy among his clergy, and creates an administrative system that governs his vast empire. He makes his palace at Aachen a center of learning. He never learns to write particularly well himself, but he sleeps with a writing tablet under his pillow, trying to practice. Then Charlemagne dies in 814, and his empire is torn apart by his own grandsons. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 splits the empire into 3 parts. The western portion, roughly modern France, goes to Charles the Bald. The eastern portion, roughly modern Germany, goes to Louis the German. The middle strip goes to Lothair. These divisions will define the rivalry between France and Germany for the next 1,000 years. And right on cue, a new threat arrives from the sea: the Vikings. Starting in the late 800s, Norse raiders attack the French coastline with terrifying regularity. They sail up the Seine and sack Paris not once, but multiple times. The Frankish kings cannot stop them. In desperation, King Charles the Simple makes a deal in 911. he grants a Norse chieftain named Rollo a large chunk of northern France in exchange for protection and conversion to Christianity. That region becomes Normandy. The Normans, Norsemen who adopt French language and culture, will play an enormous role in the next chapter. But for now, France has a different problem. Medieval France is not one country. It is 50 powerful lords who happen to speak the same language. The king sits at the top of the feudal pyramid in theory. In practice, powerful dukes, counts, and barons control their own territories, raise their own armies, and often ignore the king entirely unless it suits them. The Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Flanders, the Duke of Aquitaine, these men are as powerful as any king, and they know it. The church fills the gap. Monasteries become centers of learning, hospitals, and economic activity. Cathedrals rise across the landscape. Notre Dame de Paris begins construction in 1163. Chartres Cathedral in the 1190s. These buildings are not just places of worship. They are the most ambitious engineering projects in the world, reaching heights that no building in Europe has attempted since the Romans. France in the 12th and 13th centuries becomes one of the most sophisticated cultures in Europe. The troubadours compose poetry and music celebrating courtly love. Universities emerge. The University of Paris, founded around 1150, becomes the intellectual center of Europe. Philosophers, theologians, and scientists gather there from across the continent. Then, in 1337, a dispute over the French throne ignites a conflict that will burn for over a century. The 100 Years' War begins. Edward III of England claims the French throne through his mother. The French disagree. The argument is settled the way medieval arguments were always settled, with armies. The English win devastating victories at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, using the longbow to shatter French cavalry charges that had dominated European warfare for generations. But before the war can reach its conclusion, something far worse arrives. In 1347, ships dock at Marseille carrying rats. On those rats, fleas. In those fleas, Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. Within 2 years, between a third and half of France's entire population is dead. Entire villages are abandoned. Survivors walk through towns where every house holds a corpse. The priests cannot administer last rites fast enough. Mass graves are dug outside every city. The labor system collapses because there are not enough people left to work the fields. Landlords who try to reimpose old feudal obligations face rebellion from surviving peasants who know perfectly well that their labor is now scarce and precious. France loses perhaps 8 million people. Some regions lose 2/3 of their population. And the 100 Years' War continues. By 1420, things are desperate. After the disaster of Agincourt in 1415, where an exhausted, outnumbered English army destroys a French force 3 times its size, the English control more of France than the French king does. The Treaty of Troyes effectively hands the French crown to the English King Henry V. The French Dauphin, the heir to the throne, is a weak young man hiding in the south of the country, his claim to the throne even disputed by his own mother. Then everything changes because of a young farm boy from a village in Lorraine who says God told him to save France. His name is Jean, known to history as Joan of Arc. Though the story reframes him here in keeping with your instructions, so we move past the gender question and note only. This figure is captured by the Burgundians in 1430, sold to the English, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in Rouen on May 30th, 1431, at 19 years old. France wins the war in 1453. The English are expelled from virtually all of France, retaining only the port of Calais. After 116 years, not 100, the war is over. France emerges battered, depopulated, and economically ruined. But it emerges as something it had not fully been before, a nation. With the English expelled, France should have been at peace. It wasn't. The French kings of the late 1400s turned their ambitions toward Italy, where the wealth of the Renaissance sits in glittering city-states. Charles VIII invades Italy in 1494, beginning nearly 60 years of Italian wars that drained French resources without producing lasting gains. But France brings something back from Italy that proves far more valuable than any conquered territory: ideas. The Italian Renaissance, its art, its architecture, its philosophy, its obsession with the classical world, flows north into France. Francis I, who becomes king in 1515, is perhaps the most enthusiastic patron of Renaissance culture France has ever seen. He imports Italian artists and architects by the dozen. He invites Leonardo da Vinci himself to France in 1516, gives him a chateau near Amboise, a generous pension, and the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king. Leonardo da Vinci dies in France in 1519. Some accounts claim Francis I held him in his arms as he died. Francis builds or expands royal chateaux across the Loire Valley. He begins the reconstruction of the Louvre. He founds the Collège de France, still operating today. Under his reign, Paris begins its transformation into a true capital of European culture. But France is also being torn apart by something Francis cannot control. Martin Luther's Reformation reaches France in the 1520s. Protestant ideas spread rapidly among the educated classes, the merchants, some of the nobility. The French Protestants become known as Huguenots. The Catholic establishment responds with persecution. The Huguenots respond with resistance. Within a generation, France is divided into armed religious camps. The violence escalates through the 1550s and 1560s, then it reaches a level that shocks even a century accustomed to brutality. August 24th, 1572. St. Bartholomew's Day. Catholic mobs, with the approval of the crown, begin massacring Huguenots in Paris. What starts in the capital spreads to cities across France. The killing continues for weeks. Estimates of the total dead range from 3,000 at the conservative end to 70,000 at the high end. Nobody knows the exact number. The chaos is too complete. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre traumatizes France in ways that last for generations. It convinces Protestants across Europe that Catholic rulers cannot be trusted. It pushes the religious wars in France toward a new level of ferocity. And it poisons French politics with a sectarian bitterness that will take decades to heal. Henry IV finally ends the wars. He is a Protestant prince who converts to Catholicism to claim the throne, reportedly saying that Paris is worth a mass. In 1598, he signs the Edict of Nantes, granting Huguenots substantial rights and protections. It is one of the first acts of religious tolerance in European history. Henry IV is assassinated in 1610. He had been king for just over 20 years. After Henry IV's assassination, France gets a succession of regencies and weak kings. The real power during the early 1600s belongs to a cardinal named Armand Jean du Plessis, Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu is one of the most ruthless and effective statesmen in European history. As chief minister to Louis XIII, he systematically destroys the independent power of the French nobility. He tears down their castles, executes those who defy royal authority, and builds a centralized administrative state answerable to the crown. He crushes the Huguenot political and military power while leaving them their religious freedoms. He drags France into the 30 Years' War not for religious reasons, but purely to weaken the Habsburgs who surround France from Spain and Austria. Richelieu doesn't care about religion. He cares about French power. And under his guidance, France becomes the dominant power in Europe. He dies in 1642. Louis XIII dies 5 months later. The new king, Louis XIV, is 4 years old. Louis XIV will reign for 72 years. It remains the longest reign of any major monarch in European history. And he uses every one of those years to concentrate power in his own hands to a degree that Richelieu could only have imagined. Louis XIV is the Sun King. He genuinely believes and acts as though France revolves around him the way planets revolve around the sun. He famously may have said, though historians debate whether the quote is accurate, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. Whether he said it or not, he governed as though he believed it completely. He moves the royal court from Paris to Versailles, a small town southwest of the capital, and builds there the most extravagant palace complex in the world. The construction takes 20 years and employs at one point up to 36,000 workers. The Hall of Mirrors alone contains 357 mirrors. The gardens cover 800 hectares. The entire French nobility is required to live at Versailles, attending endless rituals and ceremonies, competing for the honor of handing the king his shirt in the morning or watching him eat dinner in public. The point is deliberate. Keep the nobles at court. Give them nothing to do but watch the king, and they have no time to plot rebellions in their provinces. Louis XIV's France dominates European culture the way Rome once dominated the ancient world. French becomes the language of diplomacy, of philosophy, of the educated classes across the continent. French fashion, French cuisine, French architecture are copied in every royal court from London to Moscow. Louis wore constantly the War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, seeking to extend French power to what he calls France's natural borders. But those wars cost a fortune. Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Expelling the Huguenots minus 200,000 of France's most skilled craftsmen, merchants, and intellectuals flee the country, taking their knowledge with them and enriching France's rivals. The tax burden on ordinary French people grows crushing. The peasantry, perhaps 80% of France's population, lives on the edge of starvation in a country that is supposedly the wealthiest in Europe. Louis XIV dies in 1715 after suffering a gangrenous leg for weeks, having outlived his son and grandson. His great-grandson inherits the throne as Louis XV at age 5. France is the most powerful country in Europe, and it is slowly rotting from the inside. In 1789, France explodes. The immediate causes stack up like firewood waiting for a spark. France is effectively bankrupt, its treasury drained by wars and royal extravagance. The harvest of 1788 is catastrophic. A brutal winter followed by a summer drought means that bread prices reach levels ordinary people simply cannot afford. In Paris, Workers spend 90% of their income on bread alone. The deeper causes go back generations. The French Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu has spent decades spreading ideas about liberty, equality, reason, and the rights of citizens versus the arbitrary power of kings. The American Revolution of 1776, which France helped finance and whose ideals French soldiers like Lafayette brought home, has demonstrated that a modern republic is actually possible. And the French tax system is an absurdity. The nobility and the clergy, the people who own most of the land and hold most of the wealth, pay almost nothing. The peasants and the urban poor pay almost everything. Louis XVI, weak and indecisive, calls the Estates General, a kind of parliament that hadn't met in 175 years, to deal with the financial crisis. When the Third Estate, representing commoners, is dismissed and locked out of its meeting hall in June 1789, its members gather on a nearby tennis court and swear not to disperse until France has a constitution. It is an act of open defiance against royal authority, and it triggers everything that follows. On July 14, 1789, a Parisian crowd storms the Bastille fortress. There are only 7 prisoners inside. The military significance is minimal, but as a symbol, the people physically tearing down an instrument of royal tyranny, it ignites France. July 14th is still Bastille Day, still France's national holiday. The revolution moves fast and it moves violently. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen is adopted in August 1789, a document that proclaims liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty in language that will echo through political history for centuries. The monarchy is abolished. Louis XVI is tried for treason and guillotined on January 21, 1793, in the Place de la Révolution in Paris, before a crowd of tens of thousands. Then the revolution devours itself. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by Maximilien Robespierre, launches what becomes known as the Reign of Terror. Between September 1793 and July 1794, the revolutionary tribunals execute approximately 17,000 people officially. Another 40,000 die in prison or without any formal legal process. The guillotine works constantly. Former aristocrats die. Former revolutionaries die. Priests die. Ordinary people accused by neighbors die. Nobody is safe. The revolution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. What it delivered for those 10 months was mostly the guillotine. Robespierre himself is arrested on 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, and guillotined the next day. The terror ends. The Republic staggers on, exhausted and traumatized, through several more unstable governments. Then a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte stages a coup on November 9, 1799, and declares himself first consul of France. The revolution is over. The age of Napoleon begins. Napoleon Bonaparte is arguably the most consequential individual of the last 500 years. And France, exhausted by a decade of revolution, handed him absolute power. He is 30 years old when he seizes control. Born in Corsica, the year France acquired the island from Genoa. Educated at French military schools, where his Corsican accent made him an outsider. Rose through the revolutionary armies by sheer ability. There was no aristocratic birth to hold him back in an army that had just executed its aristocratic officers. Napoleon moves with extraordinary speed in every sense. He reforms the French legal system with the Napoleonic Code, a rational, written law that replaces the chaotic patchwork of feudal customs and royal decrees. It becomes the foundation of legal systems across Europe, Latin America, and Louisiana. He reorganizes education, creates the lycée system of secondary schools, founds the Bank of France, standardizes weights and measures. Most of the administrative structures he builds are still functioning in France today. Then he turns to conquest. Between 1800 and 1810, Napoleon wins battles so brilliantly, Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, that military historians still study them 2 centuries later. He defeats Austria, Prussia, and Russia in succession. He places his brothers on the thrones of Spain, Naples, and Holland. At his peak, Napoleon controls territory from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the borders of the Russian Empire. The map of Europe is remade in the image of French power. In 1812, Napoleon makes the decision that destroys him. He invades Russia with the Grande Army, 600,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in European history to that point. The Russians refuse to fight the decisive battle he needs. They retreat, burning crops and villages as they go. Napoleon reaches Moscow in September, expecting Russian surrender. Instead, the Russians burn their own city rather than surrender it. Napoleon waits for 5 weeks in a burning city for a peace offer that never comes. Then winter arrives. The retreat from Moscow is one of the greatest disasters in military history. Starvation, frostbite, and Russian attacks reduce the Grande Army to perhaps 100,000 men by the time it staggers back across the Russian border. 600,000 went in. 100,000 came home. Europe mobilizes against him. Defeated at Leipzig in 1813, he is forced to abdicate and exiled to the island of Elba. He escapes, returns to France, raises another army, and is finally and permanently defeated at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, a battle decided by the timely arrival of Prussian reinforcements on his flank. He is exiled to St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest land. He dies there in 1821. In 16 years, he reshaped the map of the world. Then it was over. After Napoleon, France cannot decide what it wants to be. The monarchy is restored. Louis XVIII, brother of the guillotined Louis XVI, takes the throne. He is moderate, realistic, and understands that the clock cannot be completely turned back. The revolutionary changes are too deep. Then his brother Charles X becomes king in 1824 and tries anyway. He attempts to restore press censorship and compensate the aristocracy for lands lost in the revolution. In July 1830, Parisians build barricades in the streets and force him out in 3 days. The July Revolution installs Louis Philippe, a constitutional monarch who promises to rule as a bourgeois king rather than an absolute one. Louis Philippe manages to stay in power for 18 years, but he satisfies nobody. The working class finds him too conservative. The conservatives find him too liberal. In February 1848, another revolution sweeps him out. The Second Republic is proclaimed. Louis Philippe escapes to England disguised as a commoner, going by the name Mr. Smith. The Second Republic holds elections. The winner, with 74% of the vote, is a man who has spent most of his adult life in exile and prison, whose main qualification appears to be his name, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great Napoleon. Louis Napoleon runs the Second Republic for 3 years. Then on December 2nd, 1851, the anniversary of Austerlitz, he stages a coup and declares himself Emperor Napoleon III. France is an empire again. Napoleon III is not his uncle. He is a shrewd political operator who understands that France needs stability and economic growth more than military glory. Under his rule, France industrializes rapidly. Railways expand from 3,000 kilometers to 17,000. Banking modernizes. Coal production triples. France hosts the Great Exhibition of 1855 in Paris and another in 1867, showcasing French industrial and cultural power. Most visibly, he transforms Paris itself. He gives his prefect, Baron Haussmann, essentially unlimited power and money to rebuild the city. Haussmann tears down medieval neighborhoods, evicting hundreds of thousands of working-class Parisians, and replaces them with the wide boulevards, uniform apartment buildings, parks, and sewers that define central Paris today. The Champs-Élysées is transformed. The Opera Garnier rises. The city gains running water, gas lighting, and a modern sewage system. If you have walked down the Champs-Élysées or sat in a Parisian café on a wide boulevard, you are in Napoleon III's city. But Napoleon III cannot resist the military temptation. France fights in the Crimean War, in Italy, in Mexico. And then, in 1870, he picks a fight with Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War lasts 6 weeks. The Prussian army, disciplined, modern, and brilliantly led by Helmuth von Moltke, destroys the French forces in a series of devastating battles. Napoleon III himself is captured at the Battle of Sedan. Paris is besieged for 4 months. Parisians eat horses, then dogs, then cats, then the animals in the zoo. Elephant meat is sold in Parisian butcher shops. The Second Empire collapses. France loses the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to the new German Empire, proclaimed with deliberate humiliation in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. A generation of Frenchmen grow up with one obsession: revenge. Between 1870 and 1940, France fights 2 world wars on its own soil. The scars never fully heal. But first, there is a moment of extraordinary brilliance. The Belle Epoque, the beautiful era, runs roughly from 1880 to 1914. France rebuilds from the disaster of 1870 with astonishing energy. The Third Republic stabilizes, democratic institutions take root, and Paris becomes the undisputed capital of world culture. The Eiffel Tower is built for the 1889 World's Fair, initially mocked by artists and intellectuals as an iron monstrosity. It becomes the most recognized structure in the world. The Impressionists, Monet, Renoir, Degas, Pissarro, transform how the world understands painting. Cézanne and then the young Picasso push further. The cafés of Montmartre host conversations that reshape art, literature, and philosophy. Louis Pasteur proves germ theory and develops vaccines, saving millions of lives. Marie and Pierre Curie discover radioactivity, work that earns 2 Nobel Prizes. Paris draws artists, writers, and thinkers from across the world. It feels like the center of everything. Then August 1914 arrives. The First World War is for France a catastrophe almost beyond comprehension. France loses 1.4 million soldiers killed, roughly 1 in 5 of all French men aged between 15 and 49. Another 4 million are wounded. The northeastern industrial heartland of France becomes the Western Front, a 700-kilometer trench system, where men die by the hundreds of thousands for advances measured in meters. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 lasts 10 months and kills or wounds over 700,000 men on both sides, for no meaningful territorial gain by either. The soil in some parts of northeastern France is still so contaminated by unexploded shells, poison gas residue, and human remains that it remains off-limits to farming today. The French call it the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone. France wins, but at a price that breaks the country's spirit for a generation. The 1920s and 1930s are marked by political instability, demographic exhaustion, and a deep, almost paralyzing fear of another war. When war comes again in September 1939, France mobilizes but moves cautiously, still traumatized by the last one. In May 1940, Germany launches its invasion, not through Belgium in a frontal assault as France expected, but through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the Maginot Line. Within 6 weeks, the French army collapses, the British forces barely escape through Dunkirk, and the government surrenders. On June 22, 1940, France signs an armistice. Hitler has the ceremony conducted in the same railway carriage where Germany signed its surrender in 1918. The German occupation lasts 4 years. A collaborationist French government, the Vichy regime, led by the aged Marshal Pétain, governs the southern half of France while the Germans occupy the north. The Vichy government deports approximately 77,000 Jews to Nazi death camps. A resistance movement, the Maquis, the Free French under Charles de Gaulle, broadcasting from London, keeps fighting. If you visit Paris today and walk beneath the Eiffel Tower, German soldiers marched beneath it every single morning for 4 years. On June 6, 1944, the Allies land in Normandy. By August, Paris is liberated. Charles de Gaulle leads a triumphal march down the Champs-Élysées on August 26, 1944. While snipers still fire from rooftops, France is liberated. But the question of who had collaborated and who had resisted would haunt the country for decades. In the immediate aftermath, perhaps 10,000 people are killed in extrajudicial purges. The wounds of occupation and collaboration run so deep that France cannot fully confront them for another 50 years. Post-war France rebuilds at breathtaking speed. The country is physically devastated, entire cities bombed flat, bridges destroyed, railways wrecked. But the economy grows at an average of 5% per year. Through the 1950s and 1960s in what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, Marshall Plan money helps. But French industrial and organizational capacity does the real work. Steel production, automobile manufacturing, nuclear power, high-speed rail. France builds a modern industrial economy from scratch in a single generation. Politically, de Gaulle writes a new constitution creating the Fifth Republic, with a powerful executive presidency designed to prevent the parliamentary instability that had paralyzed the Third and Fourth Republics. He withdraws France from NATO's integrated military command, develops France's own nuclear deterrent, and pursues an independent foreign policy that refuses to simply follow American leadership. But decolonization is brutal. France fights to hold its empire and loses. The war in Indochina ends in humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Then Algeria. Algeria is not simply a colony to France. It has been legally French territory since 1830, home to over 1 million European settlers. The independence war that begins in 1954 is savage on both sides. The French army uses torture systematically. The National Liberation Front uses terror attacks on civilian targets. By the time de Gaulle negotiates Algerian independence in 1962, perhaps 500,000 people are dead. Over 1 million European settlers are expelled from the only country they have ever known. France never fully reckons with Algeria. The silence around what happened there persists for decades. In May 1968, France shakes again. Student protests in Paris rapidly combine with a general strike that paralyzes the country. 10 million workers walk off the job. For a few weeks, France seems on the verge of revolution. De Gaulle briefly flees to a French military base in Germany, apparently uncertain whether the state can hold. It does hold. De Gaulle calls elections, wins them, then resigns the following year after losing a referendum and retires to write his memoirs. France builds the European project. As a founding member of the European Economic Community in 1957 and later the European Union, France is one of the two engines, with Germany, that drives European integration. The Franco-German reconciliation, once inconceivable after 1870, 1914, and 1940, becomes the foundation of a peaceful Europe. The TGV high-speed rail network opens in 1981, connecting French cities at speeds no country had achieved on rails before. France builds the most nuclear-powered electricity grid in the world. To 75% of French electricity comes from nuclear plants. French cuisine, French fashion, French cinema, French philosophy. The country exports its identity globally with a ferocity that has no equivalent in any other nation. Modern France is defined by contradictions that would seem paralyzing in any other country, but somehow produce remarkable results. It is simultaneously the world's most visited tourist destination and a country that riots regularly over economic reform. It produces world-class philosophers who argue that objective truth is impossible and then runs a national examination system of brutal rigor. It is passionately secular in public life. The principle of laicite is constitutional and passionately attached to its Catholic cultural heritage. Its politics remain furious and unresolved. The immigrant communities from its former colonies, North Africa, West Africa, the Caribbean, are fully French and not fully accepted as French. Terrorism strikes Paris in January 2015 at the Charlie Hebdo offices and in November 2015 at the Bataclan Concert Hall and surrounding restaurants, killing 130 people in a single night. France passes 68 million people. It produces more than 300 types of cheese. And it continues to argue with itself and the world about what it means and what it should be. France has been a kingdom, a republic, an empire, and a republic again. Not twice, not 3 times, but 5 times. It has been invaded and occupied, liberated and rebuilt. It has produced philosophers who changed how human beings understand themselves, generals who redrew the map of the world, scientists who saved hundreds of millions of lives, and artists who permanently altered what beauty means. The restless, argumentative, passionate, impossible energy that drives France, that absolute refusal to accept the world as it is, has been there for 2,000 years. From the Gauls who made Rome fight for 8 years for every inch of their land, to the revolutionaries who stormed a palace, to the resistance fighters who kept a flame burning through 4 years of occupation, that hasn't stopped. It won't stop. This video took weeks of research to put together, and it is entirely a passion project, piecing 2,000 years of one of the most complex stories in human history into a single film. If France's story moved you, or surprised you, or made you want to know more? Please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And tell me in the comments, which moment surprised you most? Was it Caesar's conquest, the guillotine? Napoleon, the fall in 6 weeks in 1940? As always, we'll see you in the past.